All right, so we're super excited today through Chapters for Change to be interviewing Carolyn Roberts and looking at her new book. Yep, thanks, Jan.
Yeah.
Restoring Education, Decolonizing Your Practice Using a Critical Lens. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of Carolyn. So today we are so honored to be joining with Carolyn, a distinguished educator, speaker, and storyteller with a deep passion as an advocate for Indigenous resurgence through education. Currently, she serves as an Indigenous academic and faculty lecturer in the teacher education department at the University of British Columbia, where her work focuses on deepening teachers' understanding of Indigenous history, education, and ancestral knowledge. Thanks for joining us today, Carolyn.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into some questions, I'd like to take a moment just to do a personal land acknowledgement that I was focusing on a bit this morning. So hello, my name is Jennifer Looney. My pronouns are she, they. I am reflecting here from my home in Aurelia on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. The territory that I live and work on is covered by the Lake Simcoe Purchase, also known as Treaty 16, and the Williams Treaty of 1923, which was intended to resolve long-standing claims with Indigenous peoples here in Ontario, but instead created ongoing injustices such as insufficient compensation, inadequate reserve lands, and the inability to freely exercise harvesting rights. My ancestors were settlers to this place we now know as Canada. Long before today, there have been Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of this place. I recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made both in shaping and strengthening this community and our province and country as a whole. I feel a responsibility to help educate myself as well as others about the importance of this land, the history of Indigenous peoples, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and children across our country. As the late Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair stated, education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out. Therefore, my commitments include that I will review the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and take actions that will support truth and reconciliation. I'll continue to forge partnerships with local Indigenous communities and organizations. I'll continue conversations with my own students about truth and reconciliation and advocate for justice and equity and embed those topics throughout my courses and programs at Georgian College. I'll support Indigenous artists and authors and educate myself through reading books, attending conferences and workshops, as well as educating my children. I am grateful for elders and other knowledge holders who are willing to share their stories with us so that we may understand their experiences and work toward reconciliation. I vow to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen.
That was beautiful.
Yes, it was beautiful. Thank you. And before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to review some of those key terms that are discussed in the book, just for those who maybe haven't heard of restoring before or haven't had a chance to look at the book, which we really hope everybody will run out and get a copy if they haven't already, because it is so wonderful. And we know that it was written for educators, but it's a book that really everybody should be reading. And so the first term, so we're pulling it right out of the title here, so restoring. So Carolyn, you define that as reflecting on the past and using that reflection to make changes for the future. And specifically for education, this would involve dismantling those old narratives to make room for the historically silenced voices to be part of the story of Canada, because it's often gone unheard. And so Jennifer and I have reflected a lot on this too, where as educators, and especially educators who have uh, are coming to the work from a social justice lens, we've really started to become more critically aware of the need to restory education. But that really was not the case for many, many years. And going through the K to 12 system, um, it often went, untalked about. It was just kind of taken for granted that this was the way that things are, that the Western colonial model of education is the way that things are. Um, but again, the need to really become aware of how restoring will benefit all of us. And so another phrase that you referred to there too is restoring the system as a whole, which means transforming classrooms into spaces of, so again, deep learning. So where we're sharing and learning together, and that really ties into that relationship piece, something that is very much lacking in a lot of educational spaces still today. And then this will help us to grow by including, all of the voices that come together to make us a whole. Um, so so with that in mind, where we really went many, many years without critically thinking about, the way education has been run, and now realizing that there really does need to be a change. We're just curious when that realization came to you, when you started to become more critically aware of the need for a change, and kind of what prompted you to write this book to kind of inspire, others.
Yeah. Um, so I think that like the book is really a process of all the teaching that I've been doing since I moved from the public system up into higher education. So I've been here now for about 7 years. And I was doing a lot of talks around in school districts throughout the province and beyond about how do we actually step into this work and what does it look like? And all of my work is focused for pre-service teachers, but was equally used within talking with teachers who had been teaching for a long time, because and I'll put myself in that as well, we were never taught about Indigenous anything throughout our K to 12 system. And when you get into university and then they start to tell you some bits and pieces, depending on where you are, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, there's so much that I didn't know. And I get class after class coming into my classroom and going, I never knew about that. I was never taught about that. So it's still happening today. So this accumulation of work that I had been doing through presentations, through working with the faculty in higher ed, working with faculty associates that work with our students and school associates, and presenting and doing all that. This was an accumulation of all of those things and put into one space, because a lot of people have very similar questions. What do I need to know? How can I change things in my classroom? What should I be focusing on? All of these things were common questions that I got repeatedly at many, many presentations that I was doing. So I thought, well, if it's in a book and if it's in one place, I can enter into this space to say, so here's a way you can enter into it. Here's a way that you can do it in your classroom. And by reflecting on my own practice and what I do, I'm hoping that people can take pieces and nuggets from that to see if they can then use it within their own classrooms.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And that kind of leads into this discussion around how the Western colonial system came to be, with Ryerson being credited for creating both the public school system in Canada as well as the residential school system. And so it's really come to light more within recent years, the damages of especially the residential school system, right? Like the very overt harms that have been caused, even intergenerational traumas that still exist and are passed through the generations. But it often goes unspoken about, or not recognized, the harms caused by the public school system, and failing to make those changes to restory the system. Why do you think that there is such resistance, even though we know of the harms that are caused to many, many, not just even Indigenous students, but other diverse and marginalized voices within the school system, knowing the harms that have been caused, why we are still sticking with this model, and why there's such resistance from educators, administrators, the Canadian government to make changes moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think that, well, part of it is that people really actually don't really like change, for starters.
Yeah.
But if we take a look at the system as a whole, those people who make it into education and become teachers are the people who the system works for, right? So
Yeah.
if the system is working in their benefit, then they don't necessarily see that it's not working. So if we're looking at stats here, and I just know the stats for Indigenous educators, but we're only 4% of the education population in British Columbia. So there's not very many of us in the system that worked our way through the system in order to be there. So when I bring educators in, like my pre-service educators, I really have to acknowledge and understand and hope that they can grasp the understanding of their place within the system and where they sit within that, to be able to say that there's other people that have been affected differently by the system, that the system doesn't work for, and has proven over and over and over again that the system doesn't work for them. And I talk about that when I talk about when they talk about the graduation gap, or how Indigenous students are not succeeding like everybody else within the system. But if we flip that model and actually talk about it, that what we're saying is the system isn't caring for these students in the same way that they're caring for other students. So what is the system doing wrong? And not saying that the people who are affected by it are in the wrong, but it's actually the system. So because the system works in such a way that the people who are in power and the people who are teaching are predominantly from the specific demographic of people who are supposed to succeed, then why would they change it? Right?
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is that if you have never had any education in Indigenous education, and now you have one mandated 13 class Indigenous education course that's supposed to be able to teach you of 500-600 years of colonial and Indigenous relations, how do you how do you do that, right? So the courses aren't enough. We need to start to think about changing what we're providing for students. And then those educators that are in place, how are we supporting those educators to learn about what they need to teach? I know here in British Columbia, we do have mandated Indigenous education courses now for students who graduate from our system, but the educators haven't been given the Pro-D funds or the Pro-D in general to be able to step into this work with a sense of knowledge and understanding of what the work is. So then this perpetuates more harm for especially the Indigenous children in those classrooms. Some students we have out here are taking the mandated courses in the hallways by themselves because of the harm that happens in the classroom from other students. And the teachers, as they step into this work, a lot of teachers step into, and it's really important to talk about, but the only thing that they know a lot about, because there's a lot of resources out there, is the residential school system. There's so many other things, and Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students are getting so weighed down by the trauma that of course they don't want to learn about it. Right? So we have to balance that out in Indigenous brilliance of what are all the brilliant people in Indigenous communities doing, and how do we support this this survival and resistance of Indigenous people. Why aren't we talking about those things? But then there's a lot of things in the history chapter that every Canadian should know. So those also need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that piece that you touched on too about that the educators often don't come prepared, and it's not necessarily to fault of their own, but from a
The
lack
system.
of pre-service training to ensure that they're properly prepared to be able to address these difficult topics. Along with the mandates, I know we're in Ontario, so like the education mandates where there's very much a focus on back to basics, focusing on, increasing math skills, increasing English skills. There are some mandates for, learning of specific Indigenous languages and that. But again, if the teachers aren't prepared to be able to feel confident in addressing these topics, then again, like you said, more harm can be perpetuated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't want to miss any of our upcoming videos, make sure that you hit the subscribe button below as well as the notifications. And you can also visit our website, chaptersforchange.com, for educational resources and to see what we're up to. See you soon.